Every morning before the sun had fully stretched across the New Mexico sky, an old man arrived at the edge of an Air Force base with nothing but a worn cloth and quiet purpose. No one greeted him, no orders called him in, and yet he came, day after day, year after year. To most, he was just the old guy with the rum, polishing a forgotten relic of war. They laughed, they guessed, they never asked why. But behind that silent ritual was a story buried in courage and sacrifice, a story that would shake the very core of the base once it came to light. Because Earl Wittmann wasn't just a lonely man clinging to memories. He was a hero, a ghost from the past who had once flown into hell to bring others home. And he had been right in front of them the whole time. What happens when we finally stop to see the people we've overlooked? This isn't just a story about war, it's about reverence, about how honor can live in silence, and how the quietest among us sometimes carry the loudest legacies. Earl Wittmann was there again, just like every morning. The same faded pickup truck rattled to a stop outside Falcon Ridge Air Base, its tires crunching over the gravel with a familiar rhythm. A thin cloud of dust hovered in the air behind it, lazily settling as the sun slowly rose over the flat expanse of New Mexico desert. He stepped out of the truck with the same deliberate motion, his back slightly stooped, his canvas cap pulled low over his eyes, and a cloth already folded in one weathered hand. From inside the gate, a young recruit caught sight of him and smirked. "There he is again. Think anyone actually cares about that rust bucket?" he said with a chuckle, his voice heavy with sarcasm. The other guards nearby laughed under their breath, eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. They didn't even try to hide their amusement. Out on the tarmac, Earl moved at his own pace, slow, unhurried, methodical. He approached the Republic F-105 Thunderchief with the kind of reverence usually reserved for the sacred. The jet stood proud despite the years, its once brilliant olive-gray fuselage now dulled by time and desert wind. It was a relic from a war most of the base's younger crew only read about in history books. A Vietnam-era bird bolted to a concrete slab, meant to be looked at from behind a fence and forgotten. But not to Earl. To him, this aircraft wasn't just a symbol or a monument. It was memory. It was life. He wiped at the dust along the curve of the fuselage, fingers tracing its worn metal as if checking for a heartbeat. He didn't speak. He never did. Every movement was quiet, intentional. No loud greetings, no explanations, no stories told. Just polish and silence. He had done this every morning for years. Some of the older staff remembered him from way back. Maybe he had once been a pilot or a mechanic. No one could say for sure. Over time, no one asked. The newer generation of airmen simply knew him as the old guy with the plane, a living fixture, like the warning signs on the gate or the chain link fence bending slightly in one spot where he slipped through each day. A ghost with flesh and breath returning like clockwork. There were jokes, of course. Always, recruits with too much time and not enough reverence tossed around their theories while sipping cheap coffee at the guard post. "Well, bet he thinks it'll fly again," one would say, elbowing the other. "Maybe he talks to it," another would laugh. Someone even joked about making him a fake badge, official jet whisperer. They didn't mean harm, not really, but they also didn't care. Not enough to ask his name, not enough to wonder why. And yet, there he was, every morning. The gate never opened for him, but no one ever tried to stop him either. It was easier to dismiss him as background noise. An old man with a strange habit, a harmless routine. Earl's truck was just as much a character in the scene as he was, aged, dented, and faithful. In its bed sat a battered metal toolbox plastered with faded, peeling stickers. Inside, a tin of polish, a couple of soft cloths, a delicate brush, and a pair of gloves he almost never used. Earl preferred the metal raw against his palms, cool, rough, and honest. The touch reminded him he was still here, still connected. Each morning began the same. He would step out of the truck, lift the latch on the toolbox, and cross through the bent section of fence without fanfare. No words, no hesitation. The base's routine hadn't even begun yet. No bugle, no engine roars, just the soft hum of early patrols and the thud of distant boots on pavement. And there he'd be, already at work. He always started at the nose cone. He'd rest his hand there gently, pausing like he was greeting an old friend. A moment of stillness before the polishing began. To most, it looked like nothing. An old man obsessing over a machine that would never fly again. But what no one realized was that the truth wasn't hidden. It was right there in plain sight. And one way, that truth finally found its way to someone who remembered. It happened during an ordinary morning briefing. A general sat reviewing routine reports, equipment checks, maintenance logs, patrol notes, until his eyes froze on a name typed near the bottom of the page. His brow furrowed. He leaned forward. His voice dropped to a whisper. That man saved my life. No one in the room spoke. For a long second, the air grew still. The name had passed across many desks before, glanced over, filed away, overlooked. But now everything stopped. Everything changed. The truth was about to come to light. And when it did, the entire base would fall silent, not out of command, but out of awe. Mockery would be replaced with reverence. Laughter would give way to solemn nods. And Earl Wittmann, the quiet figure with the cloth and the memories, would finally be seen, not as a relic, not as a ghost, but as a hero who had never once asked to be remembered. He whispered something, but so softly that no one could make out the words. Other mornings he simply nodded, like one soldier acknowledging another. Then he'd begin his routine, always starting at the right wing. With slow, methodical, circular movements, he wiped the aircraft with a cloth, pausing every so often to inspect a rivet or gently brush away a layer of desert dust. To him, every inch of that plane mattered. The faded paint, the scuffed panels, the cracks etched deep into the metal from decades of wind, sun, and time. He treated each blemish not as a flaw, but as a scar, earned, honored, and carried in silence. He never rushed, never spoke. For an hour, sometimes longer, he'd move along the aircraft's fuselage in quiet focus, lost in memories, or maybe holding on to them. The base buzzed around him. People passed by. Security guards changed shifts. Recruits jogged past during their morning drills. Officers strolled through with clipboards and steaming cups of coffee. Some gave him a slight nod. A few whispered under their breath. Most didn't even notice he was there. But Earl noticed everything. He watched the way the jet's shadow moved across the tarmac as the sun rose higher. He felt the shift in the air before a mountain storm rolled in. He could tell when a fresh batch of recruits had arrived just by the way they looked at him, half curious, half dismissive. He never bothered to correct them. When someone asked why he kept coming back, he always gave the same simple answer. Someone's got to take care of her. They thought it was nostalgia, or boredom, or maybe guilt, but it was none of those things. It was duty. And like all meaningful rituals, Earl's wasn't really about the act itself. It was about what the act meant, what it stood for. The silence, the sacrifice, the memory of something once alive and roaring. That jet wasn't just metal to him. It wasn't just history or a relic of war. It was a promise. And until someone else was willing to keep it, Earl would show up every day. Same time, same cloth, same silence. Blake Mercer had only been stationed at Falcon Ridge for 4 weeks, but he already thought he had the place figured out. Every morning as he wrapped up the graveyard shift at the main gate, he'd catch the same scene, that same old man. Same tan jacket, walking the same path toward the same old jet. He didn't talk, didn't smile, didn't even seem to acknowledge the soldiers moving around him. He just made his way toward the F-105 like it owed him something. Blake didn't get it. One morning, he leaned against the concrete pillar of the gate shack, coffee steaming in one hand, and squinted into the rising sun behind Earl Wittmann. There he is again, he muttered, smirking. Think he's finally going to talk to that plane today? Private Matthew Rohr was posted beside him, arms crossed, gaze steady. He offered only a tight smile, but said nothing. Maybe he's reliving his glory days, Blake continued, chuckling. Can't let go of the one time he got near a fighter jet. Probably a janitor in Nam or something. Poor guy. Matthew didn't respond. His eyes followed Earl's movements. The deliberate pace, the way his hand moved across the plane with careful purpose. Or maybe he was more than that, Matthew finally said, voice low. Blake snorted. Please, if he were anybody, he'd have a plaque in some guy with a rag and way too much free time. The jokes weren't always cruel, but they were constant. Someone once left a BO of cheap polish on Earl's truck hood with a note that read, "For your jet girlfriend, the boys." Another called him Hangar Grandpa. It was easy to mock someone who didn't fit into the chain of command, who operated outside the polished routines and strict timetables that kept the base humming. Earl wasn't official. He wasn't assigned. He didn't wear rank or take orders. So to many, he became a running joke. But not to Matthew. Matthew wasn't the sentimental type. He came from a long line of soldiers. His father, a stern, by-the-book army man, never spoke of heroes. Only duty, discipline, orders. Still, even he couldn't ignore the way something shifted inside him when he watched Earl. There was something about the way Earl placed his hand on the aircraft before he started each morning. It was like he was greeting something alive. The way he examined every inch, not with obsession, but with care. The way he walked through the ridicule without ever flinching. Never bitter, never broken. Matthew didn't laugh anymore. He remembered something his grandfather once told him, long ago, just before he passed. Real soldiers don't brag. They carry what they have seen in silence. That stuck with him more than ever now. The military prided itself on tradition, on remembering valor, on honoring those who came before. But sometimes, Matthew realized, even the most disciplined institutions forget. They get caught up in protocol and gloss over the quiet, invisible service that doesn't make the wall of honor, but still carries weight. And sometimes the only person who remembers what really matters is the one standing alone, holding a cloth, whispering into the wind. Look closely, really look, at the people standing right in front of you. It's easy to recognize a hero when they're in uniform, medals gleaming under the lights of some ceremony. But it's much harder when that same hero wears scuffed boots, quietly polishes an old, forgotten jet, and speaks to no one at all. Earl Wittmann had never asked for attention. He simply showed up, day after day, and did what he believed mattered. Most people ignored him. Some mocked him, but not everyone. Blake never paid him much mind, but Matthew, he'd started to nod when Earl passed by, just the slightest tilt of his head. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but Earl noticed. He always did. While most on base continued to overlook him or pass whispered jokes, one young soldier was beginning to see what others couldn't. One all legends are found in history books. Some walk beside us, quietly, without seeking applause, asking only for a shred of respect. Then one morning, Earl Wittmann didn't show up. For the first time in years, the gravel patch at the edge of Falcon Ridge was empty. No old pickup, no canvas cap, no well-worn overalls moving gently against the breeze. The air still carried the same weight, and the sky remained a perfect blue. But something felt wrong, like the base itself had fallen still, holding its breath. At first, no one said a word. Most hadn't noticed. But by the third day, something began to shift, quietly, like a ripple beneath the surface. The F-105 Thunderchief still stood, unmoved, but somehow it looked different now. Less like a symbol, more like a forgotten shell. The shine on its wings had dulled. Dust crept along its seams and curled into the tail fins. What had once glistened beneath Earl's hands now sat untouched. The care, the reverence was gone. Time had begun to reclaim what he had held back for so long. Master Sergeant Elaine Rodas, one of the longest-serving officers at Falcon Ridge, passed the aircraft on her way to a logistics meeting. She halted mid-stride. For years, she'd walked by that plane without a second glance. But now she saw it and realized something vital was missing. It wasn't just the man, it was his presence, his quiet purpose. Elsewhere at the security post, Lieutenant Travis Burke leaned back in his chair, twirling a pen between his fingers as he stared out toward the Thunderchief. He smirked. "Well," he muttered, "looks like the plane polisher finally got the message." The words hung in the air, heavy with smugness. To him, this was a return to normal, a course correction. Across the desk, Private Nick Holman sat stiffly, arms crossed, eyes locked on the motionless jet. He said nothing. The sun caught the fine film of dust on the aircraft's surface. It sparkled faintly, almost beautiful, almost cruel. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. You have to admit, Travis continued, it was getting weird. The guy was treating that rusting jet like a shrine. About time someone shut that down. Still, Nick didn't respond. Travis let out a short laugh. Come on, man. You were the one who called him the wing janitor. Nick shifted uncomfortably. Then after a long pause, he said, I was wrong. And the room went quiet. Travis blinked, caught off guard. What? Nick didn't elaborate. He stood, walked to the window, and gazed out at the Thunderchief. For the first time, he truly saw the dust, saw how it dulled the aircraft's edges, how it settled in like forgetfulness. He remembered the way Earl stood beside it, the calm, respectful posture, the way his hand lingered gently on the nose, like he was remembering something sacred. It hadn't been obsession. It had been reverence, a kind of devotion no one had taken the time to understand. And now, with Earl gone, the jet felt exposed, alone. Over the next few days, whispers drifted through the ranks. A few older officers muttered comments in passing. Feels strange without him here. The plane looked better when he was around. No official statement was ever made. No one filed a report, but everyone felt it. That creeping silence, a silence that didn't feel like peace. It felt like absence. And along with it came the slow, steady weight of dust. Dust that Earl used to wipe away with steady hands. Dust that no one had noticed until it was too late. Lieutenant Colonel Adam Keene wasn't one for sentiment. His life ran on structure, spreadsheets, clearance checks, fuel schedules, command briefings. But that Thursday morning, while reviewing a stack of routine reports, one name in a disciplinary memo caught his eye. Earl Wittmann, civilian, removed from... The name stirred something in him, a flicker of recognition, like the fading pulse of an old radio transmission, barely reaching across decades. Lieutenant Colonel Keene furrowed his brow, tapping the edge of the folder absently with his pen. He didn't recognize the name from recent rosters, nor from any base records in the last few years. No, this was older. It came from a place buried deep within him, etched into memory by fire and time. He gently slid the folder aside and leaned back in his chair, the creak of the leather under him drowned by the dry wind rattling the blinds. Outside, the desert stretched wide and empty. The F-105 Thunderchief stood silently by the gate, its once proud silver body now dulled by age, dust hugging its curves like a forgotten monument. Keene rose from his seat and moved to the back of the office, to the filing cabinets left untouched for years. His hand hesitated over the one labeled Archives, Vietnam era, before pulling it open with a metallic groan. The air inside smelled like history, aged paper, ink long faded, time itself folded into yellow documents, and grainy photographs tucked inside plastic sleeves. He thumbed through the names one by one. Donovan, Hartsfield, McNeil. Then he found it. Wittmann, Earl H. He slid the folder out and set it carefully on the desk, as if afraid to disturb the weight it carried. The top sheet was a personnel file, name Wittmann Earl H. Wittmann Earl. Rank, Captain Aircraft, F-105 Thunderchief Unit, 11th Tactical Fighter Squadron. Service dates, 1963-1975. That alone might have merited attention, but what followed stopped Keene cold. Commendations lined the page like battle honors on a general's chest. Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal, 4 Purple Hearts, the Air Force Cross. He turned the page. A mission report, dated 1972. Laos. Wittmann had flown solo into hostile territory, deep within enemy lines, through anti-aircraft fire so thick it was described in the report as a wall of iron. 2 pilots had gone down. Wittmann's aircraft took damage. He didn't retreat. Instead, he deployed flares to draw fire away, held formation, and extracted both men under direct assault. And just 2 days later, he did it again. This time, it was a Marine unit. Cut off, trapped, no backup. Wittmann went in alone. No fanfare, no hesitation. Keene sat back in stunned silence, his hand resting on the edge of the folder. The man everyone had brushed off as a harmless oddball, just some eccentric who loitered around the aircraft display, had once stared death in the face and answered with courage and steel. He flipped to the last page, a black and white photograph taken in 1973 during an award ceremony. A line of pilots stood at attention, medals shining against their dress blues. And there in the center, younger but unmistakable, stood Earl Wittmann, his shoulders squared, his jaw set, eyes steady. The look of a man who had been to hell and come back with others on his shoulders. Keene held the photo tightly, the edge bending slightly beneath his fingers. Something shifted inside him, a quiet reckoning. This wasn't some clerical oversight. This was a disgrace. They hadn't just ignored a veteran. They had erased a hero, forgotten a legend. He stood abruptly, gathering the folder and the photograph. His boots struck the floor with new purpose as he made his way down the hallway. There was only one person who needed to see this first. General Raymond Colton was not easily shaken. He was carved from discipline and years of war, having survived 3 tours, 2 wars, and more red tape than any man should. His office was a fortress of order, everything in its place, nothing sentimental. But as Lieutenant Colonel Keene stepped into that office, holding the faded folder and photograph like relics of some sacred truth, even Colton sensed a shift. "Sir," Keene began, his voice steady but taut, "I believe we've made a grave mistake." Colton didn't look up. "We make a dozen of those before breakfast, Colonel. What kind are we talking about?" Without a word, Keene stepped forward and laid the photograph on the desk. Colton's eyes flicked down, then froze. There they were, the rows of airmen in ceremonial dress. But one man stood taller in the frame, as if even the camera had known he mattered more. Calm, resolute, familiar. Colton leaned in, breath caught halfway. Is that? "Yes, sir," Keene replied quietly. "Captain Earl Wittmann, Air Force Cross, over 50 combat missions in Vietnam, multiple high-risk extractions under fire." He paused. "This is the same man security told to stop cleaning the F-105. Colton stared at the photo, unmoving. That name, he didn't remember it from paperwork. He remembered it from survival, from fire, from war. "My God," Colton murmured, barely audible. "That man saved my life." Keene said nothing. The room didn't need more words, not in that moment. Colton stood slowly, his expression no longer that of a commanding officer, but of a man staring back through time, through smoke, through blood, through sacrifice, and in that stillness, in that breath between past and present, both men knew this wasn't just about respect, it was about redemption. He remembered the mission like it had happened just yesterday. Laos, 1972. The jungle had swallowed them whole. His unit was pinned down, ambushed without warning. 2 of his men were badly wounded. The radio had gone dead, no backup, no way out. Hope was slipping away fast. Then, like thunder cutting through the clouds, an F-105 came roaring in low, skimming treetops with defiance and precision. It shouldn't have been there. It was too deep in enemy territory, but it came anyway. At the controls was Earl Wittmann. "He got us out," Colton murmured, almost to himself, not to Keene. "No backup, no clearance. He flew straight through hell to save us." Keene shifted uncomfortably, cleared his throat. "Sir, he's been coming to this base every single day, for years, cleaning that jet, alone, quiet, and we treated him like an inconvenience." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed, heavy with guilt and something deeper. Shame. Colton didn't sit back down. He walked slowly to the window, the light of the afternoon casting a warm gold across the base. From there, he could see it, the F-105, weather-worn, resting beneath a soft layer of dust, but still there, still proud, still his. "I want his address," Colton said sharply, his voice cut clean. "Now." Keene didn't flinch. "Already on your desk, sir." Colton turned toward the door. "Get my driver. We're going." "Should I notify public affairs? Arrange something formal?" "No," Colton snapped. Then quieter, almost reverently, "Not yet. This isn't for cameras. This is for him." 20 minutes later, a black SUV rolled to a stop in front of a small, single-story house tucked at the edge of town. The gravel driveway was quiet, undisturbed. An American flag fluttered gently from its post near the front door. Colton didn't wait for anyone to open the door or give him a signal. He stepped out, strode up the porch steps, and knocked firmly. The door creaked open. Earl Wittmann stood in the doorway, silent. For a second, he was just a man in a faded work shirt, sleeves rolled up, hands still stained from restoring a rusted toolbox earlier that morning. But the second he saw the uniform, the way the 4 stars rested on Colton's shoulder, something shifted. His spine straightened, not from fear or habit, but out of respect, deep, quiet, and unspoken. Their eyes met, and in that moment, words weren't needed. Recognition passed between them like a current, the kind of bond only men who had walked through fire and lived to tell of it understood. "Captain Wittmann," General Colton said softly, "I've come to apologize." Earl didn't say anything right away. He stood there, eyes locked on Colton's, expression unreadable. Then finally he gave a small nod. "General," and he replied evenly, "didn't expect company." Colton took a step forward. "May I come in?" Earl opened the screen door without hesitation. Of course, and inside the house was just like the man, quiet, sturdy, and without pretense. The furniture was old but clean. The walls were bare of accolades. No medals, no framed honors, no shadow boxes commemorating a hero's past, just shelves lined with aviation books and worn photo albums turned slightly inward, as if they were meant more for remembering than showing. There was a coffee pot on the counter, a stack of neatly folded towels, a folded American flag encased in glass resting solemnly above the mantel. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, no fanfare between them. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind that pilots knew well, the silence before takeoff. Steady, bracing. "I owe you an apology," Colton began, his tone heavy but sincere. "On behalf of the base, on behalf of the entire Air Force." Earl arched an eyebrow but said nothing. "You were removed from that aircraft, laughed at, ignored, dismissed like you were just some old man who didn't belong. And no one knew." Colton reached into his coat and set a photograph gently on the table between them. "A ceremony, 1973. No one knew who you were." Earl looked down at the photograph. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just studied it, the way a man might study a map back in the war, quietly, carefully, like something sacred. "I knew," Colton said, softer now. "Eventually, you saved my life, Earl. Laos, 72. You brought us home when no one else would." Earl's eyes lifted, no longer passive. "I remember," he said simply. "You were barely 23. Your radio guy got hit. I had to drop through a wall of Terpopoe to get to you. Took a piece of shrapnel through the intake." Colton blinked, his voice caught slightly. "You never told anyone." "What for?" Earl leaned back in his chair. His voice was calm, even. "My time passed a long time ago. Those boys on base, they're the future. They don't need to know who I was. They just need someone to keep that jet clean." "But they mocked you." Earl gave a dry chuckle. "I've been called worse." Then after a pause, his voice softened again. "You can't blame people for what they don't know." Colton shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on the man before him. "That's not all," he said firmly. "That jet, it's the exact one you flew, isn't it?" Earl paused, his hand resting gently on the polished metal of the aircraft, and then gave a faint, knowing smile. "She's the same bird," he murmured. "I checked the serial number the first time I saw her here. She was supposed to be scrapped. Somehow, she ended up with me instead." Colton's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not just chance, welcome." Earl gave a small shrug. Maybe not. Maybe it's just what was supposed to happen." Silence followed, heavier than before, thick with the weight of time and memory, of everything left unsaid over the years. Colton finally stood, brushing off his pants. "I won't keep you any longer," he said, voice steady. "But tomorrow I'd like you to come with me back to the base." Earl raised one eyebrow, his expression curious. "Which I am," Colton met his eyes. "Because they need to hear the truth. And because some mistakes don't get fixed behind closed doors." Earl didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted toward the small window above the kitchen sink, where the last slivers of desert light were beginning to fade into dusk. After a long moment, he spoke, quiet but resolute. "I'll come, but I won't say much." Colton's smile was soft, almost relieved. "That's all right. Your story says enough on its own." The next morning, beneath a pale blue sky, the F-105 stood at attention as if it had been waiting all these years. But something in the air was different. The usual mechanical hum of the base had given way to something more charged, a quiet anticipation that moved like a current beneath the surface. Whispers circled through the hallways. Officers and enlisted men alike lingered by windows and doorways. Support staff paused in their duties. Even civilian contractors looked up from their tasks. Something had shifted. Word had spread. By 900 hours, a crowd had formed near the gate where the jet stood proudly. No one had made an announcement, but somehow they all knew. The man they once dismissed as just the old guy with the rag wasn't merely a retired serviceman. He was someone whose name still echoed through archived flight logs and long-forgotten combat reports. Someone who had flown through fire and smoke to bring others home, and now he was coming back. When the black SUV rolled through the main gate, the guards on duty snapped to attention. General Colton stepped out first, his gaze scanning the crowd before giving a firm nod. Then the passenger door opened and slowly Earl Wittmann emerged. He wore no uniform, no ribbons or shiny medals, just that same tan jacket weathered by years, and the calm, steady look of a man who had already said everything that ever needed to be said. As he stepped beside the general, the murmurs that had stirred among the gathered crowd disappeared into silence. Every eye followed Earl's slow but deliberate steps toward the F-105. His gait had changed over time, slower, heavier, but there was something unshakable in the way he walked, something that couldn't be trained or ordered, something earned. Colton raised his hand, signaling for attention, and began to speak. "This is Captain Earl Wittmann," he said, voice cutting clean through the stillness. Between 1969 and 1973, he flew more than 50 combat missions during the Vietnam War. He was awarded the Air Force Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and multiple air medals for extraordinary valor and skill in combat. He paused briefly as a ripple of awe moved through the crowd. He saved lives, Colton continued, risked his own over and over again, and he never asked for recognition. He never sought it. For the past several years, Captain Wittmann has quietly cared for this very aircraft, the same model he once flew, and in this case, the exact jet, not for glory, not for show, but because he believed it deserved to be remembered, because the people it represents, his brothers in arms, deserve to be remembered. Earl didn't speak. He only looked up at the jet, his eyes tracing every familiar contour, the rivets, the faded numbers, the scars that told stories only he understood. Then, parting the crowd, a young figure stepped forward. It was Travis Burke. His shoulders were tense, jaw clenched as if holding back everything he did not know how to say. Behind him came Nick Hallman, head lowered, but his steps deliberate, purposeful. "Captain Wittmann," Travis said, voice just loud enough to carry over the hushed crowd, "we owe you an apology for everything we said, for what we didn't see. What we didn't know." Earl's gaze met theirs, not harsh, not judgmental, just real, honest. "You made a mistake," he said softly. "But you're standing here now, that matters more." Nick swallowed hard. "Sir, we'd like to start a new tradition, if you'll allow it. From today forward, a different member of this base will care for the jet each day, not just to honor you, but to honor everyone who's ever worn the uniform." Earl looked at the young men, then his gaze drifted to the faces beyond them. So many youthful eyes searching for something more than permission, something deeper than approval. He nodded once. "Then take care of her." And just like that, understanding began to bloom across the base. A quiet realization that honor wasn't found in medals or speeches or parades. Sometimes it lived in silence, in sacrifice, in a man who had already given everything, and still came back to give a little more. The medals we wear aren't always pinned to our chests. Sometimes they're the silence we keep and the dust we choose to wipe away. It began quietly without ceremony, at dawn the next morning, before the first call of the relay echoed across the base. A young airman appeared beside the F-105 with a soft cloth in his hand. No one had told him to be there. There were no orders, no schedules, just instinct. He came anyway. And by the end of that week, others followed. A quiet, unofficial rotation began to form. No ranks, no roll calls, just one new figure each morning. standing where Earl once had, carrying on the ritual. Some brought polish, others wiped away dust with the sleeve of their fatigues. A few left folded notes on the cockpit glass. One simply stood at attention and saluted. Without anyone saying it out loud, a tradition was born. Earl still came, less often and not always before sunrise, but he came. He didn't work alone anymore. He would approach quietly, nodding to whoever was already tending to the jet. Sometimes he would sit off to the side in a folding chair that one of the younger recruits had brought just for him. They began asking him questions, and Earl, never one to seek attention, would answer plainly. No drama, no exaggeration, just truths. Not of glory, but of risk, of burden, of responsibility carried in silence, of what it meant to show up again and again with no one watching, no one cheering. His stories weren't about medals. They were about lives saved, lives lost, and the invisible weight he still bore for both. To many on the base, Earl Wittmann had transformed. He was no longer a shadow from the past, some old man in a battered jacket. He became a presence, a bridge between generations, a living lesson in what honor really looks like. It doesn't come with decorations or uniforms. It's forged in humility, sustained in quiet, and passed down without a word. 6 months later, without fanfare, the base held a quiet unveiling. No parade, no speeches. Just a small group gathered around the F-105 for a moment of shared understanding. A bronze plaque was installed beside the aircraft. Its words were simple, in honor of Captain Earl Wittmann, who flew through fire to bring others home, and returned not for glory, but to care for the wings that once carried him. But the plaque wasn't the true memorial. The ritual was. The reverence passed hand to hand morning after morning was. The silence that replaced mockery, that was the legacy. Each time the sun broke over the wide New Mexico horizon, it struck the F-105's fuselage just so. The old Thunderchief gleamed, not from museum wax, but from the labor of those who now knew what that plane had seen, and who had once sat in its cockpit. Earl never spoke of legacy. He never asked for credit, never sought gratitude. Even after the base knew exactly who he was, he always introduced himself the same way. Just Earl. But something had shifted, not in him, but around him. Where once there were chuckles and sideways glances, now there was quiet. Where jokes once followed, now came respect. The airmen who had once dismissed him began bringing their morning coffee to the jet, just for the chance to sit nearby, to be near the silence he carried like a second skin. Some came with questions. Some came only to listen. Earl spoke softly, not of war stories with big endings, but of leadership that didn't shout, of courage that came without fanfare, and of sacrifice that went unrecognized. His voice carried no bitterness, only a weight that never fully lifted. And they could see it in his eyes. That plane wasn't just metal to him. It was a resting place for memory, a sanctuary for the souls he'd flown with, a promise he'd made and kept. He didn't clean it out of nostalgia. He cleaned it because it mattered. And in that small act, repeated over years, he taught the entire base what no manual, no drill, no decorated speech ever could. That service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. That some heroes don't return for applause, but for remembrance, because history isn't just ink on a page. Sometimes it's fingerprints left on aging steel. It's silence that means something. It's a cloth passed from one hand to another, and a head bowed in quiet understanding. So every morning, as the sun spills gold over the New Mexico desert, the F-105 gleams once more. Not because of ceremony, not because of pride, but because of hands, steady, reverent, knowing, who understand now what it means to remember. Not all legends roar. Some walk quietly among us, head down, cloth in hand, heart full. And thanks to Earl Wittmann, they'll never be overlooked again. In today's fast-moving world, where bright lights and viral moments often define what's noticed, there are still a few quiet reminders of what it truly means to live a life of purpose without ever needing applause. Earl Wittmann was one of those people. He never asked to be seen, never demanded a thank you or expected praise. He just showed up day after day with consistency, grace, and quiet strength. Until one day people finally looked a little closer and began to understand why. In an age where attention spans shrink and the past feels like a blur, Earl's life calls us back to something more grounded, something lasting: honor, commitment, humility, words that once shaped the very soul of this nation, now too often drowned out by noise and distraction. But Earl's story isn't just about him. It's about the quiet heroes all around us. The neighbor who waves each morning but keeps to himself. The older gentleman sitting alone at the corner table of a coffee shop. The school janitor who remembers every child's name but goes unnoticed by most. The man in the driveway, slowly bringing life back to a rusted old truck. What extraordinary stories are we walking past each day because we never stop long enough to ask? Maybe that's the lesson here. To pause, to notice, to wonder, to remember that greatness doesn't always wear a uniform or stand in a spotlight. Sometimes it wears overalls, or a quiet smile, or weathered hands that once carried more than we'll ever know. We'd truly love to hear from you. Have you ever known someone who lived humbly, only to discover later that they had once done something deeply meaningful, something heroic in its own right? Do you believe we, as a society, do enough to honor those who give without needing to be seen? Leave us a comment and share your thoughts, especially if you or someone in your family has served. Your stories matter. They deserve to be told. And if this story touched your heart, please give it a like. If you believe in this power of storytelling to preserve dignity, to carry history forward, and to shine light on lives that speak volumes without saying much, subscribe to our channel for more. Because some of the most powerful lessons don't come from the loudest voices, but from the lives lived quietly, with honor. Thank you for being here. To those who served, we see you, we remember, and we're deeply grateful.